Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stevens. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your sermonette. And I'm sorry the props have sort of gone off in different areas. It's always good to look at things a bit. But I've got something to show as well, so it might get a bit distracting. But if you want to, if you begin to wander your attention a little bit from what I'm saying, and perhaps you can just look at that one over there and see the effect of not putting God first, which, picture paints 1,000 words, doesn't it? And although I've got a few pebbles still around here to go in, we didn't get them all in. But there are 6 pebbles missing. So that wasn't bad, was it? And thank you for the opening prayer as well, because the world has seen some horrendous things in this past week. And the peace that we enjoy here is wonderful. And I thank Mr. Cracknell for thanking God on all of our behalf for the peace that we enjoy. The subject of my sermon is War and Peace. And you've probably been watching throughout this week, the early part of the week, the nation's remembrance that a century ago, this country and the British Empire at that time went to war in Europe. You would have seen all the images, and they were all in the Tuesday morning newspapers, of the young royal family, the younger members of the royal family in Belgium, with the speeches by European leaders. You probably saw the candlelight occasion after 10 o'clock on Monday evening, when the lights went out in Europe, that famous statement that was made back then in 1914. And you might have watched the red ceramic poppies. And that's an amazing piece of artwork around the Tower of London. And you've probably seen the pictures of it. And that's just a fraction of what it will become. Because by Armistice Day, that's November the 11th, the last poppy will go in. And I think there are about 120,000 at the moment. And the total number will be 888,246, which is the exact number of all the British and colonial casualties in the First World War. Each one of those poppies stands for an individual person. It was inspired by the poem Blood-Swept Lands and Red Seas, written by an eyewitness who was there and penned that poem down. And I think that's as graphic a statement as Churchill's Blood, Sweat and Tears, isn't it? Blood, sweat, toil and tears. These are statements of war which stick in our minds. And all of those poppies, and they'll be sold for £25 each. So if you want a memento of the occasion, a remembrance of the occasion, and that will go to the war casualty charities that exist now, £25 each after November the 11th. But I think one of the most poignant statements that we heard about this was the name of the last and the first casualty. The first casualty was Private John Parr, the first man to die in the First World War, the first British serviceman, Private John Parr, just 17. And he obviously got in underage, didn't he? I think he'd been around since he was 14, I think, wanting to get into the war. Just a little kid, really. And then the last one to die was George Ellison, who died on Armistice Day, and he was 40 years of age. But he would have been a bit of a veteran at that time. And of course, the First World War has got all sorts of names and phrases attached to it. The war to end all wars. I heard one church leader in this commemoration saying that what they were celebrating this past week was a repentance of war. Well, I'm not sure that I would completely agree with that, but it is a remembrance of a terrible time. It was not the war to end all wars, we know that, and I won't try to list all the statistics. You can go on Google and you can find the numbers of wars that went on during the 20th century, and you'll be staggered at how many there were. And you can even find the number of wars that have taken place in the 21st century, and that's quite a list that you could look at. We won't look at all of those. But is the end of war the same as peace? Is that what peace is, the ending of war? Well, this is the subject this afternoon. 2 centuries ago, we're looking at 1 century ago to the beginning of the First World War, but 2 centuries ago, another war was raging in Europe. And there is a book written, and it's called War and Peace. It's quite a volume. In fact, my copy is in 2 volumes. And I've always wanted to read this. And several months ago, I started reading it. And it's got more than 1,400 pages. It's one of the 7th longest novels ever written, according to the authorities. And I've got 200 pages left to read, so I'm doing pretty good. I've been reading it for several months. It's the sort of book you can put down. Tolstoy, I like authors that write in short chapters, because if I'm going to sit down for an hour at night and read something, I like to end it, if you know what I mean, not sort of stop halfway through. So he writes quite short chapters, so you can put it down easily. And you've got to have a bookmarker in it, otherwise you'll never find where you were again. But it is a very interesting book to read. And Tolstoy wrote this account. It's the account of the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. That's the theme. It's about war. I've come to the last 200 pages and I haven't yet found a lot of peace in the book. I'm hopeful that there might be something at the end, but I suspect, I've looked at the end. I know how it ends. The end is, I've got to read yet, is Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, one of the greatest disasters in all history. And when we look at statistics and we look at the numbers of dead, like 888,000 and so on in the First World War, that's 4 years. In this campaign of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, which lasted only 6 months, both sides lost about 500,000 people in there. So the figures are rather staggering. The book was written by Tolstoy some 60 years later, so he has a lot of first-hand accounts to draw from. It's a bit like somebody writing about the Second World War now, which, of course, much has been written about that. And the story begins in 1805. The invasion of Russia by Napoleon was 1812 in the summer, and he retreated in the winter with great disaster and tragedies, as you probably know from your history, if you've read any of this. He has fiction mixed with fact, which, as a historical novel, is very, very interesting to read it that way. I like historical novels. It's about 5 Russian families, and the families are sort of written after Tolstoy's grandparents, that generation above him, his grandparents, and their contemporaries. Those are the fictional characters. And there's Natasha, one of the families. This was Morag Hood. This, by the way, is a BBC presentation, these photographs of War and Peace in 1972. This was Natasha Wood, not Natasha Wood, Morag Hood, who played Natasha. And then the hero is Andre, played by Alan Doby. And the third character on the edge of the spine of the book, Anthony Hopkins, who played Pierre, an interesting character. The two, the hero and the heroine, have a tragic relationship. Tragic. But anyway, in case you want to read it, I won't spoil the end for you. So those are the characters, the fictitious characters. And Tolstoy also has 160 real people in the story. Not the least, of course, is Napoleon Bonaparte, who he portrays very well, and Alexander I, who was the Tsar of Russia, the grandson of Catherine the Great. He was a young Tsar who was hero worshipped by the people. Now, the point that I'd like to bring here about this book, we're not going to go into any details particularly about it, because I want to move on to something else, but the springboard from this book is this, that Tolstoy argues in the book, he writes a lot of history, he doesn't just stay on fictional accounts of the people that he's portraying, he speaks a lot about history, and he argues that the forces, the powers that win battles, the forces that lead troops to victory, the forces that get defeated, those heroes that we read about, he says that that's not true at all. What wins battles, he claims, are the individual people, the 888,000 red ceramic poppies. These are the people who sway the events of war and peace. And he writes this over and over again. Now, in 1812, of course, they had no communications except by flags and runners and messengers. And he illustrates his point in many ways by showing that orders were given to the soldiers across the battlefield, and by the time the order was brought by a runner, the forces of the war changed drastically. For example, the order could be to advance, and by the time that order was brought to the front, the army was in disarray. Or even worse, an order could be given to withdraw, and when that was carried to the front, the commanders who were busy really winning the battle, well, they just went on anyway and carried on. So orders were continually being conflicted by the circumstances of the battle itself. So the point there is that it's the people in the field, it's the people in the battle that decide the outcomes of these events. Of course, history writes it differently. It talks about the genius of Napoleon. Tolstoy doesn't agree with that at all, that Napoleon was a genius. Anyway, those are his points. And I'd like to show in this sermon that indeed, as far as we're concerned also, war and peace with us are in the power of the individuals. Now, a good starting point for the study of war and peace is found in Romans. Let's look in Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3. And we want to begin to see our responsibility in this subject. In Romans chapter 3, and verses 10 to 18. This is describing the carnal world around us. In verse 10 it says, "As it is written, There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understands. There is none that seeks after God. And remember, Paul here is talking about Jews and Gentiles, which from his perspective was the world around him. He says there's none that seeks after God in verse 11. In verse 12, they are all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There is none that does good, no, not one. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongue have they used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips. Whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. This is the world around us. This is the carnal world. Verse 17, and the way of peace have they not known. Verse 18, there is no fear of God before their eyes. You know, this is the world, this is the carnal world. Now, you may say, well, you know, there are some good things. Well, it's true. And there are some very terrible things. I'm not going to give you a lot of statistics in this sermon, but you've probably heard some of these, that in the world at this moment, there are 45 million people displaced from their homes through wars and conflicts. So that's a pretty miserable situation for those. In verse 17 we read, the way of peace have they not known. Regardless of peace treaties, you know, Alexander I and Napoleon made a peace treaty, and then Napoleon attacked him. That's the sort of world we live in. I don't have to bring out the news of this past week. We've all been watching treaties and ceasefires and truces breaking down again and again. You've heard of the roadmaps to peace. I think that was 2002, 2003. George W. Bush's administration had a 3-phase roadmap for peace in the Middle East. It didn't get past the second phase. The way of peace they do not know. Truces is not a peace. A truce is usually a pause to reassemble yourself on both sides of the argument. Ceasefires are not peace. Peace envoys do not produce peace. Scripture says they don't know the way to peace. Ban Ki-moon is the Secretary General of the United Nations. I think he's a very nice man. He seems to be a very patient man. He seems to be just the man to be able to sit down with both sides and to try to talk reasonably. That's the impression that you get from him. In this past week, he shouted out. He said, I am angry. Stop killing each other. Those were his words at the situation that we've been seeing in the news, almost tearing out his hair at the lack of the ability of people to come to the peace table even and begin to discuss things. Well, to stop killing each other would be a good start. We would all agree with that, although peace is much more than just stopping killing each other. It's a step in the right direction, and there is a place for practical things, obviously. And we'll look at 3 proverbs. Keeping in mind the world doesn't know the way to peace, but there are practical things that help. If we look in Proverbs chapter 17, we'll just look at 3 proverbs along the way. They're all, I think, around about the same open span of pages in your Bible. In Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 14. Proverbs 17 and verse 14. This is good advice. This is something people can do, something we can do and should. Verse 14, it says, the beginning of strife is when one lets out water. That's pulling the plug out the dam. Or leaving the tap on in the bathroom. Or whatever. It says, therefore, the second part of the proverb, here's the advice. Here's what we can do. Therefore, leave off contention before it be meddled with. Let's walk away from it. I had an old uncle who's long since gone. And he used to tell us as little kids, laughing, he used to say how in the workplace, he was an electrician. In the workplace, he said he really used to enjoy getting a group of guys together during the break and getting a good argument going. There was plenty to argue about in the politics, religion, football. It doesn't really matter what it was. He'd get a good argument going, and when they were really at loggerheads with each other, he'd walk away laughing. And we always think that was really funny. But that's really not. No, not only is it not the way to peace, it's the very opposite, of course. So it says here, leave off contention before it be meddled with. The other two are similar. Let's look in 19, just over the page, and verse 11. 19 and verse 11 says, the discretion of a man defers his anger. In other words, he gets control over himself. Someone who's got a bit of a short fuse, bring it under control. And it is his glory to pass over a transgression. Somebody makes a mistake in your family or at work or your neighbour, pass over it. Just let it go. People don't tend to do that, do they? I wonder what we do. And the third one in chapter 20, all very similar. This one, it says in chapter 20, verse 3, it says, it is an honour for a man to cease from strife. That's an honourable thing to do. Some people think, well, I've got to get my 2 penneth in here. I've got to say my piece. I say it's an honour to pass over a strife. But every fool, it says, will be meddling. Well, there's a good start, isn't it? That's a good start towards ending conflict, at least. I won't say we're yet into peace, but we're ending conflict. Even the philosophers can see the value of some of these practical steps. I heard a quotation from Plato. I think we had Plato last week from Mr. Malin. This was on Thought for the Day. Plato said, and I thought, this is really, you could really think about this on the bus, just muse on it and think about it. I don't think it's in the scriptures, but it's near enough to be in the scriptures. Plato said, be kind. Everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. So be kind. Isn't that nice? If we meet Plato, I'd like to shake his hand for that one, because that's a nice thought. So not a bad rule, is it, for daily life? Now, I mentioned peace maps, or road maps to peace, as they might call them. What I'd like to do is give you a peace map that really works. I would say, I'm not going to say that only in God's church does it work. That would be presumptuous. Because we can see even Plato had a certain approach to dealing with people. But because we are God's church, then this is a peace map that works particularly in God's church. And I've got some points. The first point, I'd like you to turn to Luke chapter 1. Where does peace come from? Where does it originate? We read in Romans there that the way of peace the world doesn't know. And we can put ourselves into that as well, as having been in the world a lot of our time. In Luke chapter 1. Now this is what is called Zechariah's prayer, or his song of thanksgiving at the birth of John the Baptist. I want to just read three or four verses of this. John the Baptist, you recall how Zacharias went blind, and when they named him John, sorry, he was dumb, wasn't he? When they named him John, he began to speak, and this is what he cried out. In Luke, towards the end, verse 76, let's begin there, down to verse 79. He says to his son, John, he says, "And thou, child, shall be called the prophet of the highest. For you shall go before the face of the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation unto his people by the remission of their sins." This was John's commission. Prepare the way for the coming of Jesus Christ. Verse 78, "Through the tender mercy of our God, thereby the dayspring from on high has visited us." This is now looking to the coming of Jesus Christ, the job that John the Baptist will have of preparing the way and proclaiming that he is the Messiah. And verse 79, still this is now looking at Jesus Christ, "To give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace." Think of feet guided in another direction. This is what Christ, through John the Baptist, who will announce him, this is what Christ is going to do. He's going to guide our feet into the way of peace, the way that the world doesn't know, but we can know. The second scripture, John 14. Turn forward into John 14. Now there is a prophecy, isn't there, that says that Jesus is the Prince of Peace. We'll probably come to that towards the end. In John chapter 14, this Prince of Peace, speaking to his disciples, and verse 27, it says, "Peace I leave with you." Peace I leave with you. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He can give peace. How? How does he give peace? He says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world gives." The world doesn't know the way to peace. "Give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." So Jesus will give peace. He's promised it here. We can claim that promise always. If we find that our life is in a bit of a turmoil, if we find that we've got things a bit wrong with the rocks and the pebbles and the sand in our life, if we find that we've gone a long way down the wrong path and we're not following that good advice of prayer and study, and begin to get caught up with the world that knows no peace, then that promise is still there. Peace I give you. But how does it work? Well, he is the Prince of Peace. And in Philippians, you don't have to turn to Philippians, chapter 2 and verse 5, you might like to make a note. I think Mr. Luxton said don't turn to Philippians. I wonder why. Perhaps we should turn there. No, that was for time, but we'll turn to Philippians anyway. We don't want to have the impression that nobody turns to Philippians anymore. So let's turn to Philippians and just look at this one, chapter 2 of Philippians, and verse 5. It says, "Let this mind be in you." Now, this is the mind of Christ. Let the mind of Christ be in you. Now, Christ is the Prince of Peace. He has peace. He understands how it works. And he says, I'll give it to you. I'll give you peace. And then we'll turn to Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6. And Romans chapter 8 and verse 6. Romans 8 and verse 6. This mind of Christ that we can receive is described here. In verse 6 of chapter 8 it says, for to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. So if we receive the mind of Christ, we're receiving this Spirit, the Spirit of God. We're receiving the Spirit that Jesus had. We're receiving the same mind that he had. We become of the same mindset as Jesus, and he is the Prince of Peace. So if we receive the mind of Christ, and he says, I'll give it to you, I'll give you peace, so we can have peace. Now, once we have the Spirit of God and we have peace, then we are called peacemakers. If you turn to Matthew 5, this is one of the Beatitudes. Matthew chapter 5. We are called peacemakers. Now, that's a fairly obvious title, isn't it? A peacemaker. We all know what a watchmaker is. A watchmaker makes watches. If you're in the engineering business, you might have heard of a toolmaker. I think Peter was a toolmaker. Isn't that right? I think he was a toolmaker. Makes the special tools needed to do engineering jobs with. So he makes tools. If you work on a farm, you might be a haymaker, which means you make hay, hopefully while the sun shines. So here we find that Jesus said to his disciples in one of the Beatitudes here, number 9, verse 9, he said, blessed are the peacemakers. So those who have received the peace that comes from Christ, we who have the mind of Christ, we who have been given the Spirit of God, become peacemakers. And Jesus adds, and they shall be called the children of God, of course, because we have the mind of God. So we are his children. So that's quite a responsibility, quite a challenge, that we are peacemakers in a world that doesn't know anything about peace. Now, peacemaking in action. This is what we need to look at. And let's turn to Romans chapter 14. So we've had a few points here. Point number 1 is that John the Baptist would point to Christ, who would turn our feet. It's a process. We're moving round towards peace. And then the point number 2 was that Jesus, who is the Prince of Peace, said, I will give you peace. Point number 3 is to have the peace of God is to be spiritually minded. And then point number 4 is that we are now peacemakers. And in Romans 14, we'll see peacemakers in action. Romans chapter 14 and verse 19. Romans 14 and verse 19. Paul said to the Romans, let us therefore follow after things which make for peace. Let's follow after things that make for peace, and things wherewith one may edify another. So here is peacemaking in action amongst ourselves. Little disagreement might come up. Let's pursue peace. Differences of opinion. Well, we all have differences of opinion, don't we, on some things. We're all different kinds of people. We've all got different makeups and different backgrounds. So we might have some little differences of opinion. The important thing is that we follow after peace always. People offend one another, perhaps accidentally. I once had somebody phone me up and said, "You said something, did I?" And we talked about it, and it was all resolved. I can't remember who was right and who was wrong. It doesn't matter. Point is, it was resolved. So this is how we should be. This is how we follow after peace. We've got the mind of God. We've got the peace that Christ promised and will continue to give. But we have to be peacemakers in action. But there is more than this. There's more than this. It's not just a passive thing. It's not just a question of making a phone call and that's okay. That's a bit like these practical things that we read in Proverbs. Perfectly okay. But there is more to it. There's a certain urgency about this that I want to show you now. In 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. Peter quotes from the Psalms. We won't read the Psalm. You will recognize it. We also sing this Psalm as well. I don't know if Mr. Stevens has got that lined up for the last song. He may well have. In 1 Peter chapter 3. This is quoted from the Psalms. And in verse 10. We'll read through 10 down to, well, just 10 and 11 I think will be enough. It says, "For he that will love life and seek good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it." Now, the word ensue in the King James is one of those old English words that's had its meaning changed in modern English. To ensue means to follow one thing with another. He ensued that B was carried out after A was done, and so on. That's what it means now. But what it used to mean in 1611 was pursue, which chases after. It's very similar, one thing following another, rather than chasing after. Pursue is what it says in the Psalm, Psalm 34. Pursue peace. Let us pursue it. There is a sense of sort of determination and urgency about it. Seek peace and pursue it. Now we have a song. And if you've got your songbooks handy, let's turn to it. In the songbooks, number 53. Song number 53. I'm not going to sing it yet. Song number 53. I did bring my songbook here, but I can remember the words. It's the first line repeated in the third line. It says, "Depart from evil, do what is good. Seek peace, pursue it earnestly." Now that's Mr. Dwight Armstrong's, I think, inspired, or you could say poetically, to make the line rhyme and to make the rhythm and so on. But to seek peace and to pursue it earnestly is really an eagerness, a desire, a determination to have peace amongst ourselves. I think that's extra word is, as I said, if it's not inspired, and I know we don't treat everyone in the church's writings is inspired necessarily, but it certainly fits the idea of seeking peace. Well, we've come down 6 points. Very simple, that Christ is the Prince of Peace, and we can have peace, but we must seek it. We must be earnest about it. So we've come quite away from Ban Ki-moon's stop killing one another and Plato's be kind to one another, to actually seeking peace earnestly. Well, you know, a roadmap always leads somewhere, doesn't it? And your sat-nav will probably say to you, you have reached your destination. Well, I've got an Australian voice on my sat-nav, and he tells me, you have reached your destination. Apologies to Australians who may be watching. But there is an end result. There is a place or a destination to the paths of peace. Let's turn to 2 more scriptures. In Isaiah chapter 2. Turn to Isaiah chapter 2. Here is a destination. It's not the destination, but it is a destination. And we would say perhaps a very wonderful destination for this world. And in verse 1, we'll read verse 1 to 4, first 4 verses of Isaiah chapter 2. It says, the word of Isaiah the son of Amos so concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it. And many people shall go and say, come you, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations. That means God is going to settle all the disputes. And there are many disputes between all the nations. Ancient disputes, disputes that go back hundreds, even thousands of years. There are disputes still going on from the 6th and 7th century AD. And God will settle all those disputes. He will judge among the nations and rebuke many people. So some people are to be corrected strongly for the way they have lived. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. A nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. All the military academies, I don't know what we'll do with them all. Turn them into supermarkets, I suppose, or something. My daughter lives at Shoebury, and they're still finding ordnance in the sand and digging it up. And my daughter's father-in-law tells me that there's a bomb in the middle of the channel there. I don't know, it sounds a bit scary to me, that they can't touch it, can't go near it, it's just sitting there at the bottom. And my daughter's father-in-law told me with considerable relish, I don't know why, he only lives on the edge of it. He said it will, it will blow the whole of South End up if it goes off. I think he was overstating it, I hope he was. But what will they do about it, I don't know. But hopefully it will sit there until the kingdom comes, and then it could be dealt with. But it says they won't learn war anymore. But look, they will beat their swords into plowshares. Now, I went to New York a few years ago. I just had a day trip. I wasn't in Britain, I was in America anyway. We had a day trip to New York. And of course, you've got to go and see the United Nations building. And they have an art collection in the United Nations, pieces of art given by all the different nations who have contributed, all part of the United Nations, and have contributed pieces of artwork. And in the park, they have this figure beating a sword into a ploughshare. I was surprised how small it is, because you can never tell in a photograph, can you? But it's really an excellent, dramatic piece of sculpture work. And it was made by a Russian. Back to Russia. I've got his name here, Vucetich. And I think the Russians do their CHs as chus. Well, they're Khrushchev. I was trying to practice this, because trying to think of names. I've read so many Russian names in here that they're just pictures in my head. I don't even bother to put them through my tongue. You know, when you read, you just sort of photograph it in your head and recognize it when it comes up again. But his name is Vucetich. And they've just struck a silver 2-ruble piece in commemoration of his 100th anniversary of his birth. He's dead now, but his 100th anniversary of his birth. And on that piece, you can see it on the internet, is his figure, nice-looking guy. He didn't die very old. And behind him is the man with the hammer, you know, the classic stance and the sword bending down. And you can see that he's beating the edge of the sword into a lip like this, like a plough blade. And you can see that, you study it, and you can see how it's all been done. So this is the picture we have here. It isn't peace yet. Now that may be surprising, because peace is not the absence of war. Peace has to come. Peacemakers are here, and we will be, of course, involved in this world to come. Let's turn over to Isaiah 9, and we'll see where the peace is. Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9, and in verse 6, we're really back to the birth of Christ again, birth of Jesus, and the time of John the Baptist. It says, "Unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end." Now there's something to meditate on. The increase shall never end. The increase of the government, which is the kingdom, which is the family of God, the increase will never end. Goes on and on, increasing forever. And along with it, peace will increase and never end. That's mind-boggling, isn't it? We're looking at peace amongst ourselves, resolving the little disputes that we might have, being able to talk to one another, being able to pass over, you know, some little transgression or however you want to judge it, whatever it is, some little, you know, problem. And here we have now the world to come where peace will go on and on and on. Won't that be wonderful to be a part of that? Well, we are part of it now. We are now peacemakers. We are now the children of God. And this is our destination.